All right. Hello. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jason Hanley.
And my name is Mandy Smith.
Really appreciate all of you joining us here tonight. We're coming to you live from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, Ohio. In fact, the museum is open behind us. You'll see some folks coming by. Mandy and I are actually here in one of our great new exhibits called The Garage, where you can actually come in and participate and pick up a guitar, sit at a drum set or a keyboard, and get involved in being in part of the band. We are really proud this evening to be able to be presenting this great panel discussion in conjunction with the American Musicological Society. We've been doing a program with them for 10 years now. In fact, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And this is part of the annual meeting that's happening right now. Actually, it's kind of last weekend and this upcoming weekend. Yep.
We're in the middle.
We're in the middle, right in the middle. And we're really excited to be coming to you. We've been working with the AMS, the American Musicological Society, for 10 years, presenting lectures on popular music and specifically connected to rock and roll, which is, what we do here at the museum and at our library and archive, which is just down the street from us and houses an incredible collection of documents, handwritten lyrics, books, magazines, cassette tapes, recordings. It's a pretty incredible place, and it's really been great over the years to bring a lot of scholars in to see what's in the library and archive and then present their research to a general audience. So out there this evening, I know there's probably some of you from the AMS. Hello to all of you. Hello. It's good to see you again. Card-carrying musicologist here. And to anyone else who's just joining us this evening to check it out, that's right. Thank you. Do you have your card with you?
No, we don't have cards.
We should have cards.
We should have cards.
Let's put that in the next meeting. We need cards. And hello to everybody else who's just joining us out there. We're going to have a really fun night tonight, talking basically about popular music, rock and roll history, looking at some of the presentations that have been done over the last 10 years, and also getting a chance to think about where popular music studies is going right now. What are people thinking about who are actually doing this for a living and looking at rock and roll and popular music, analyzing it and thinking about what it is and teaching it in colleges, universities, or museums around the country. So before we get rolling with our program proper, I would like to welcome the Vice President of the AMS, Danielle Fazla-Lucier, who is the Vice President. And Danielle, welcome. I know you're coming to us from Columbus, Ohio State. Go Buckeyes.
Down the road.
We're neighbors.
That's right.
Thank you. On behalf of the American Musicological Society, I welcome everyone to tonight's AMS Rock Hall lecture. I'm glad you're here. Together, we're marking 10 years of collaboration between the AMS and the Rock Hall in bringing together musicians, listeners, fans, and people from music studies who care about popular music. We value this collaboration. It's an important way to share the history of rock and roll and to extend that history by telling stories and opening our ears to many kinds of music. The Rock Hall's mission is to engage, teach, and inspire. And the AMS seeks to expand the understanding of music and sound. The past 10 years have seen a tremendous explosion of knowledge about popular music, presented through exhibits, documentaries, books, articles, and more, with both of our organizations helping researchers build that knowledge and supporting access to it. I want to take this opportunity to recommend to you a book that just won the AMS's Kinkledye Book Award. It's entitled Black Diamond Queens, African American Women and Rock and Roll, written by Dr. Maureen Mann. That book and other award winners are featured on our website, amsmusicology.org, a testament to that ongoing revolution in our knowledge and understanding of music. Now I'll turn the mic back to Jason Hanley and Mandy Smith, who will introduce this evening's speakers and moderate the conversation. Thank you.
Danielle, thank you so much. Again, really great to be partnering with the AMS. And you mentioned Maureen Mann's book. We should say great recommendation. We just had her do a program with us a while back. So anybody can also check on the Rock Hall website and see that fantastic program Maureen did.
Highly recommended.
Yes, agreed. Well, thank you for joining us tonight. Appreciate it, Danielle.
Thanks, Danielle.
Thanks. I'll be waiting backstage.
Awesome.
Excellent. All right. Well, I thought it might be fun just to even, talk about that 10 years, of doing this series. It's been a really interesting road. And I went back and actually looked back a little bit. And it was literally in January of 2010 that Joe Honor, who was with me at Stony Brook University while I was a grad student there and he was teaching. And Joe had written me a letter once I started working here at the Rock Hall and said, hey, the AMS has this lecture series with the Library of Congress. Would you be interested in doing something with the Rock Hall? And it took us a little while to figure it out. We ended up having a great meeting, Joe and I, and the great Bob Judd, who was with the AMS for many, many years. And we came up with the general idea of what this lecture still is today, right? A way to share the great scholarship that's being done with a general public. And I know, Mandy, you and I have talked a lot about this idea of public musicology over the years, too.
It's something that we care a lot about. Being card-carrying, AMS members, we really enjoy thinking about music on a deep level. But then being, public servants here at this museum, we want to take all that great knowledge, not just from our own research, but from other musicologists, and really get that to all different kinds of audience. So we always talk about, we might teach the same thing, but we're going to teach it totally different to our toddler rock audience than we are our community college class, than we are during our AMS lecture series.
Yeah, that's right. It's different ways of thinking of the same history, the same music, but putting it into those different places and how do you engage those different audiences, right?
For sure.
I should also say, thank you to the many people at the AMS who helped us over the years, particularly even for tonight's event. I want to thank Siobhan Walker, Allison McCarty, and Katie Vandermeer, all of whom helped us organize this and put it together, make sure it fit into the schedule of the AMS events, but also to a lot of the past presidents even of the AMS, particularly Christopher Reynolds and Ellen Harris, who actually was, I think she was the first AMS president to come and take part in an event here at the Rock Hall. It was a lot of fun. She was really pushing for public musicology, as Chris Reynolds was too, back in the day. Also, thank you to our great Rock Hall staff who's helped over the years, including Andy Leach, who's the director of our library and archive. For a number of years, we hosted this very event over there, which was a lot of fun. And hopefully there's many more years to come. If you are a member of the AMS and you are interested in presenting as part of this series, which means you get to come to Cleveland and you get to hang out with Mandy and I and present to a great audience your scholarship, there's a link down in the comments. And I think, John, we might actually have it. I don't know if you can. There we go. You can visit the AMS website where you can actually view archived recordings of previous lectures. And you can fill out an application if you want to present as part of the AMS Rock and Roll Hall of Fame lecture series. I also want to just throw up a little bit of some of the slides of the history, because one of the things we'll talk about here tonight with some of the past presenters and one gentleman who is going to present soon. We had such an incredible list. The first year, it was an invited lecture. We invited Albin Zach and David Brackett to come out and actually present on some of their work. And it was really great to be able to think about, if you look at this list, the amazing diversity of rock and roll sounds, everything from, Albin and David there talking about the early days between Elvis and David Brackett talking about, classic blues and hillbillies, right away to, we're getting into hip hop, into Mark Clegg, whose book is coming out right now on the Star Spangled Banner. And then, John, I think we've got another slide of some of the other lectures too. There we go. Stephanie Vander Wel is with us tonight on her Rose Maddox paper. Great piece on Jacqueline Warwick on Dad Rock, which was a lot of fun. Steve Baur on The Backbeat. Daniel Goldmark, who shared some of his stuff on Rhino Records. So you can see it's such a great list that continues. We've also got a good schedule coming up. We had to pause it for a while during COVID, but we are going to be having a bunch of upcoming lectures that, again, cover a real great diversity of what popular music is, and different ways to think about it. Everything from Robin James, look at the charts, to, sort of Matt Brennan and Brian Wright, basically covering the rhythm section of rock and roll, right? So we're really excited. Stay tuned to rockhall.com and to the AMS websites to see what some of those upcoming events are going to be. So, Mandy, why don't you take it away and introduce? We'll bring each of our guests on one at a time. And once we build up our panel, we'll get started. But go ahead, you can take the first one.
Sure, absolutely. So the first person joining us is Steve Baur, a really great friend of mine. He is the Associate Director of Music and an Associate Professor of Musicology and Gender and Women's Studies at Dalhousie University. He has all kinds of research interests, including 19th century music, American music, Russian music, and my personal favorite, of course, rock drumming. He actually has a new publication out in the Cambridge Companion to the Drum Kit all about the cultural history of the backbeat. So how's it going, Steve? Welcome.
Thank you, and thanks for organizing this panel, Jason and Mandy, and thanks for inviting me. It's going very well. It's great to see you both.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. All right, up next, we have David Brackett. And I think we should probably say most of these folks are old friends of ours, so it's going to seem like an old home evening here tonight, and it's so great to be able to see everybody. David Brackett is a professor of music history and musicology in the Canada, and is the Canada Research Chair in Popular Music and Society at McGill University. And David's research focuses on the relationship between categories of music and categories of people, a topic that is at the heart of his book, Categorizing Sound, Genre, and 20th Century Popular Music. David and I have known each other for a long time. In fact, I'll admit David was on my PhD dissertation committee. So David, welcome. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing real well. Thank you, Jason and Mandy.
Well, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. Mandy, I guess you get to introduce all the drummers I see here, too.
Yeah,
this worked out.
I maybe kind of planned it that way. Next up, we've got another drummer. Should we have a drum roll?
Yeah, I know.
Theo Cateforis. Theo Cateforis is an associate professor and the director of undergraduate studies in fine arts and music history and cultures over at Syracuse University. He also has a lot of research interests that span popular music. You know, he's written on everything from new wave to math rock to alternative rock, and given papers on drumming as well. Welcome, Theo. How's it going?
It's going great. It's really an honor. I'm delighted to be here. I feel like we should do a synchronized backbeat at some point if we can make it happen. I don't know.
Even if it's not synchronized, it will achieve a sort of like when the levee breaks, effect. It'll be perfect.
Right,
There
a
you
little
go.
bit delay.
Yeah.
Delayed backbeat, yeah.
Exactly.
My 15-year-old son is a drummer, so maybe he can join in too.
Perfect.
Drums are just
Four
in the
drummers.
Who else we got tonight, Jason?
All right. Well, another great friend of ours, Loren Kajikawa. Loren is associate professor of music at the George Washington University, and his main area of research and teaching is American music of the 20th and 21st centuries, with a special attention to the dynamics of race and politics. Welcome, another great friend of ours, Loren. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well, thank you. It's good to be here in good company.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really great to have you this evening. And then, Mandy, you want to round it out with our last panelist?
Absolutely. Last but not least, we have Stephanie Vander Wel here. Very excited to welcome her back. She is an associate professor in the Department of Music at University of Buffalo. Her research interests, again, span popular music, American music. One of my other favorite topics, women in music. And in fact, she has a great new book out about women in country music. So welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's wonderful to see everyone.
Yeah, you too. It really is wonderful to see all of you guys. The last
on the screen, everyone together. I'm really
year and
excited.
a half, with all us living in our own virtual worlds. But it's nice to see all of us sort of at least virtually for this evening here in one place together. I was saying in the introduction, one of the things I think that's been really rewarding about doing this lecture series over the last 10 years is just how many different topics and ways of thinking about popular music we've been able to work into the program. And each of you brought something really interesting and unique in the way that you presented, both from time periods you were looking at to the way you were thinking about music and analyzing it. So we thought maybe we would just start out kind of going around here and asking each of you just to talk a little bit about what you had presented as part of the lecture series, and maybe even updating us a little bit. Where did that research go, or where did it come from? And, is there anything that you have that was connected to maybe a publication or something based out of what you did? So we'll just stick with the alphabetical order, I think, that we introduced everybody in. So Steve, we'll put you up first, if you don't mind.
Not at all. Thank you. Well, so this project on the backbeat for me actually started out as a commission. One of the senior editors at the New Grove Dictionary of American Music, Jacqueline Warwick, wisely thought there should be an entry in backbeat in the new edition. So she asked me to write a 50-word entry on the backbeat. 500 words later,
Yeah.
I submitted it, and she convinced the series editor to accept the full thing. But I realized at that point there was a lot more here, and what I was really interested in is tracing the origins and early history of the backbeat, which is no less than a revolution in Western rhythmic sensibilities that takes place in the middle of the 1950s. When and where does it develop? In what contexts? And what did it mean in those contexts when it emerges on the mainstream in the 1950s? Why is it so controversial? In fact, I start the project with a clip of a film that was running nonstop at the Rock Hall of Reverend Jimmy Snow telling his congregation, I'll tell you what's wrong with rock and roll and what gets these kids all riled. It's the beat. It's the beat. It's the beat. And he was right. So that project started out as a 50-word entry. It is now in print in the Cambridge Companion to the Drum Kit, but it's still a work in progress because this chapter version of it is a skeletal version of a larger argument that is going to be a book that is tentatively titled Sex, God, and Hard Labor, A Cultural History of the Backbeat.
That's a great title. Everyone's going to buy that book.
Yeah, and of course, just thinking it's something Mandy and I talk about all the time. I'm a keyboard player and Mandy's a drummer, but we all the time here with thinking about music at the Rock Hall, rhythm is essential, right? I mean, like you said, Steve, it's the center of so much popular music that it all hangs on, both musically, but also then even culturally in many ways, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you very much. David, we'll go back to you now. You have the longest to remember back, because as I said, I think you were the second presenter in the AMS lecture series. But that's a project you've been kind of working on and since a lot as well, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And thinking back on that talk, it's interesting because what was it was about a 45 or hour long talk. And at the time, I thought it was going to be one chapter of my book. And then by the time the draft got to around 200 pages, I realized it was probably more than one chapter. So it ended up being the first 4 chapters of the book. So the whole talk is rather broad. And I guess I'm just drawn to those kinds of questions. So I hope I don't go on too long here kind of explaining that talk and what it became. I'll try to keep things concise. So that talk was called Foxtrots, Hillbillies in the Classic Blues. And the material later appeared in my 2016 book, Categorizing Sound. The talk was focused very much on the relation between the major categories that emerged in the 1920s in the United States music industry, which included race music, old-time music, and foreign music, as well as a 4th category, which didn't really have a name, but we could now refer to it by calling it the mainstream or something like that. And I was very interested in how these categories, 3 of them explicitly evoked categories of people. So race music was music associated with African Americans, old-time music with rural white Americans from the southern US, and foreign music with recent European immigrants. And 2 of those 3 are still with us in one form or another, even have continued up to the present. So in reflecting on how I came to be writing about this topic, I think that it really goes way back. And even in the preface of the book, I say I've been working on this, longer than anyone would want to admit. And it went back to the early 1990s when I was working on my first book, Interpreting Popular Music. And a chapter in that book on James Brown was partly a response to an article by Philip Tagg titled open letter: Black music, Afro-American music, and European music. So I had kind of struggled with this article because in that article, Tag attempted to problematize the terms in his title by dissecting the essentialism he found in discussions of Black music, the inconsistent reference to different style traits, musical style elements, and how heterogeneous the practitioners and audiences were for the music discussed in the scholarship on Black music. He also found the presence of the same musical traits in so-called European music. So his article is, extremely rational, and it kind of drew me. I was kind of drawn up short when I first read it because I found it very hard to argue against it, but I really felt there was something deeply wrong with it. Because I agreed with his critique of essentialism and how style traits by themselves couldn't define the category, but it seemed to be missing something, like the power of the concept of Black music in people's lives, particularly in African American lives. I was interested in how the concept was used and why it continued to function or have such an important function despite all the apparent contradictions involved. So at the beginning so I was really interested, that expanded to a more general interest in how types of music were related to groups of people, demographic groups of people. So at the beginning of Categorizing Sound, I discuss an episode from the Dave Chappelle show called White People Can't Dance Experiment.
Right.
Which is a way, and in this he shows, he's making fun of what I call in the book homologies, which is that there's a direct connection between a type of music and a type of people. But then, these connections seem really absurd. He shows the absurdity of them, but at the same time, my theory is the laughter also shows that people recognize on some level that they're accurate. So at the same time, they're ridiculous, but they're also seem to tell us something important. So why did I go back to the 1920s? Well, that was when, it was really when recordings started to dominate the US music industry, and when the industry found a need to come up with these different large categories for different types of music connected to different audiences. So my working assumption was that these categories were not stable. The borders between them weren't stable. The categories themselves are not stable. And I wanted to understand the process through which the different recordings and performances were grouped together, how they became associated with a group of people, and how then this connection between music and people becomes in turn connected to a particular label, like race music or old time music. The story, the book is very detailed because I wanted to look at, how an idea sort of gets picked up. Many ideas, historically emerge and there are many ways of describing a type of music, but only a few of them stick around. So why, and you see this at the beginning, like old time music is called all kinds of things. Music from the southern states, Grandpa Jones fiddling tunes. And I just made that up, but there's just like, at first when people recognize, oh, there's this type of music that's significant, but then you can see like journalists, which is where I traced it, trying out all kinds of different names, and then eventually one sticks. So how does that happen? I was really interested in that. And but anyway, my idea is that these things are very significant because, they tell us something important about sort of our cultural priorities. Why have we settled on this way of sorting out music? I mean, to me, it tells us that race, geography, class, and gender, sexuality, these categories of identity are extremely important, and particularly race, overall, and that's something that's really lasted a long time. We also see that the identities of European immigrants kind of faded over time. The significance of that in a broader cultural sense, which was extremely important in the 1920s. By the 1950s, partially because the flow of immigrants from Europe had slowed way down, it's no longer something that shows up. So this is, musical categories are kind of an expression of shared cultural myths in a way, about, and tell us something about what we think is important. It may seem rather abstract, but I also think it gives us a way of talking about, why music can have very strong social connotations and social associations. So I use the concept in my teaching, undergraduate teaching, graduate teaching, and I think students connect to it. At the same time, there's a controversy going on now around streaming and the impact of that on genres and how we create categories of music, because some people would argue this represents a kind of a sea change. Anyway, I'll just leave it there. And there's also a plug for another panel I'm on Saturday afternoon, which is called Genres After the End of Genre, or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, David, it's awesome to hear you talking about all that too, and it reminds me of why we picked you to sort of start the series off all those 10 years ago, as you were working on all these things, and even thinking back to, interpreting popular music, which I know for me was such an important text and formed a lot of my thinking. But I saw Loren chiming in, and Stephanie, you mentioned earlier, I think both you guys used David's sort of text in a lot of your teaching in classes too, right? Yeah. And I think that we can come back in this panel maybe a little bit later too to some of these ideas of genre, which are so important in rock and roll
and style too. Because actually one of the reasons that we picked the 5 individuals on this screen is all of you in your talks either talked about genre boundaries or markers of style. And so we thought that this would be a nice sort of cohesive panel to make.
In fact, our next person up here, Theo, hasn't given his talk yet, but it's coming up. But Theo, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're going to be presenting about? But I know it comes out of a lot of the work that you've already done for many years on popular music.
Yes. Thanks, Jason and Mandy. Well, I was under the impression I was here to actually give the entire talk. So no, just kidding.
That's right. Add some more time on the clock, please.
So yes, this is a talk that is in the future. It was one of the COVID casualties that had to be postponed, but I am definitely very much looking forward to giving it in the near future. So my talk, which I think showed up on the slide, is Soft Loud. This is, as you were mentioning, tied to a specific kind of music or a genre, that of alternative rock. And I think, like a lot of my work, it's one that comes both out of my interest in sound and style, as you were mentioning. And I really got interested in this idea of soft loud as a type of a kind of modification of a verse chorus form that became identified as a sonic marker in alternative rock. And I really dug more deeply into it when I realized, through my teaching, that I had to find some way to explain to my students, when we were talking about alternative rock in the classroom, like, how do you recognize it? Like, how do you hear it? As teachers, we look for things to give our students that we can then test them on at a later point in the semester. So that was a great one for me. Like, if you're going to get tested on alternative rock, then you can know that this soft, loud song form, where you have a soft verse followed by a loud, explosive chorus, it's a really kind of handy way to recognize a sonic marker of that, genre of music, and then you kind of cement that in your mind. So like a lot of stuff that I write about, it does relate back to my teaching. And I think that's probably true for many of us, that's the way we kind of work through things. Anyway, very briefly, and what I will eventually be talking about at the Rock Hall, I kind of peel back some layers and ask, like, well, how did this song form emerge within alternative rock? How does it change over the course of the 1990s, when alternative is really the kind of dominant, rock form throughout the music industry at that time? Does it become mannered in some way, stylized? Does it shift? Does it change? So really, I take the soft, loud song form as a way to kind of tell a story of alternative rock throughout that decade, kind of from birth to death. So I like these kind of narratives and storytelling and close listening, and then connecting it with things like, social explanations, like, when you hear this soft, loud, does it like tap into like anger and alienation, catharsis? Like, what is it actually, telling audiences, and why do they respond to it? So that's the kind of, I guess, basic preview of what eventually I will be giving for the AMS Rock Hall. And I think that's enough for now. But again, very much looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Theo. We're looking forward to it too. We're looking forward to hopefully getting you here in Cleveland soon. It'll be great. All right, up next we have Loren. Loren, why don't you tell us a little bit about the project you did when you were here and sort of what that relates to in your research?
Yeah, I think the title of my talk was Before Rap, DJs, MCs, and Pre-1979 Performances. And I mean, really, I probably should have put Grandmaster Flash in the title of that talk, because he really was the central focus. And, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five are he did the first hip hop inductees.
Yep.
I think they are, right? Yeah. Yep. So they're inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And the thing about them is most people know them because of, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, the big hits like The Message, White Lines, probably the greatest anti-drug song that nobody takes that way. People know them for their recordings, right? And that's mainly how you get into the Rock Hall, is you sell a bunch of records and everybody knows your name, and you have an influence and you get in. But through my research and teaching on hip hop history, the thing that I realized was that Grandmaster Flash, on most of those recordings that have his name on them and that he's famous for, he's not even doing anything on those records. He's not one of the rappers, he was the DJ. And in fact, his greatest contributions to hip hop culture and hip hop music actually happened before 1979. And had to do with the innovations that he created in live performances and parties and playing in New York City, in the 1970s. And really, so a lot of what my talk was trying to make the case that you can't really understand Grandmaster Flash's influence on popular music by judging him on his recordings alone. You actually have to understand what he did on the turntables prior to, Rapper's Delight and the birth of rap songs as a genre, because hip hop was going on for, over a decade prior to that. And the talk that I gave focused on some surviving tapes, because there are these bootleg cassettes of live performances, right, by DJs and MCs in the era before, Rapper's Delight and the first rap songs getting commercially recorded and released. And so I analyzed what Flash was doing on the turntables, how he was remixing, existing records, disco records, funk records, jazz records, rock records. I mean, he was taking records from all different genres, as long as they had the kind of funky beats that he and other people, like, and the dancers like to dance to, and the MCs like to rap over. And he was, remixing them on the turntables. And so I found a way of creating a way of analyzing and sort of noting really what he was doing with those records and representing it visually, so it could be discussed in detail. And what I noticed was there's a really big difference between what you hear pre-1979, what you hear DJs doing live, and then what you hear when musicians start going into the studio to lay down the first rap songs, right? You go from a performance practice that's pretty spontaneous and unpredictable, where the DJ's in control of the sound, and you kind of never know exactly what's going to happen next, and the rappers or the MCs have to adjust to what the DJ is doing. You go from this like really spontaneous party atmosphere to a very stable backing track that really features the MCs. And so I was really able to explore, kind of compare what you hear on Rapper's Delight and other early rap singles that came out in 1979, 1980 to what you hear happening in the late 1970s at live performances. And that really became the foundation for my book, Sounding Race and Rap Songs, which came out in 2015. It ended up being the first chapter of that book. And even more, I think the morning after I gave my Rock Hall talk, Mary Francis, who at that time was an acquisitions editor for University of California Press, happened to be in Cleveland visiting Case Western Reserve University at the time. So we had breakfast like the day after my talk, and that's actually what led to me getting a book deal or a book contract with UC Press. So I kind of owe the Rock Hall not only for the opportunity to put this talk together and present to the community in Cleveland and have this archived as a part of on the website and have this talk be there, but I kind of owe you for the opportunity to be in Cleveland in September at that on the right day to seal the deal with Mary Francis.
I forgot all about that. I think she was in town to talk to Case grad students about publishing.
That's right. That's right. It was a stroke of luck, and it worked out well. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, Loren, I do remember too your talk. I always loved the way you represented, like you said, the visually,
yes,
so that people could follow along with the music, the way the DJs were working. And you bring up, of course, another great thing that's sort of been hinted at by Steve and even a little what Dave was talking about, the performance practice of music, right? And this idea of how these DJs and the music sort of eventually gets codified as one thing, right? When it gets onto record, but it's this sort of much more open, fluid practice early on.
Yeah.
And I think you still hold the record as the most watched AMS Rock Hall lecture. So congratulations on that.
I don't know. It might be some self-promotion. I've definitely told, students to check it out before as almost in place of a reading assignment. So,
that's good. We recommend that. That's good idea.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And last but not least, Stephanie, why don't you tell us a little bit about the project you presented here? And I know some great news about where that went too.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun coming to Cleveland and presenting my work. So this paper, I think it was titled something like Rose Maddox's Roadhouse Vocality and the California's Rockabilly Scene. So this talk, was really concerned about how Rose Maddox, who started with her family band, the Maddox Brothers and Rose, were a transitional band from Western swing to rockabilly. And in California, in the California country music scene as it was developing in the late 40s and early 50s. And I was really interested in Rose Maddox's vocal tone, her vocal approach. And I remember I think my talk traced how she really tried to sound like a singing cowgirl at first. She would cover Patsy Montana's songs, and Patsy Montana had a very bright head voice and could yodel. And when she would yodel, she would reach up until like really high up in her range. And so young Maddox was trying to imitate this. And I think Patsy reaches to like a E above, like an E, like 2 E's above middle C. And Rose Maddox can only reach up maybe to the C sharp if she's lucky. And her brother's like, come on, get that note. You can do it. And so Maddox gives up her career as a singing cowgirl. She just really doesn't have the voice type for it. But she is singing in the roadhouses and dance halls of California, whether it's in Central California or in the more swanky, Southern California dance halls. She really develops a really loud belting vocality. And she develops this with this kind of transitional stylistic development of rockabilly. And when she goes and she leaves her family band, she signs with Columbia and as a solo artist. And so she becomes like this first generation of women rockabilly artists. She records rockabilly. She's one of the first women to record like first women to record rockabilly songs, first like white woman recording rockabilly in California. She predates Wanda Jackson and like Laura Lee Perkins. I think she even predates Brenda Lee too. Like young woman or young man blues, or no, Wild Wild Young Men. That's one of the songs I talked about in the talk. And I make that argument. She really carves out this space, this kind of creative and musical and vocal space for women to occupy in 1950s rockabilly, like post-World War II, Cold War America, singing about sexuality and desire and then these kind of like really explosive, interesting ways with a really distinct vocal style that separates Maddox from people like her contemporaries like Kitty Wells, who had a much more tight nasal sound. I mean, Maddox, though, Rose Maddox, she could do everything. She could imitate that sound too if she wanted to. And she did, like in her hymns, like if you listen to Philadelphia Lawyer, she does sing it really in this kind of Southern vernacular style, kind of this tight nasal sound. So that was the talk. And that talk became, I think, 2 chapters. Like I kind of divided the whole comparing her to singing cowgirls, developed into a whole nother book chapter on Carolina Cotton, quite an amazing Western swing vocalist who, if you've ever, was this amazing yodeler who yodeled with Spade Cooley and his orchestra so fast. She would do these fast 16th note yodels going up and down like a half step, super fast. I mean, just really extraordinary. And so this became kind of part of this larger project of my book that came out at such a lovely time, March 2020. So here's some publicity, shameless publicity. Oh, I have it right here. So here it is: Hillbilly Maidens, Okies, and Cowgirls, Women's Country Music, 1930 to 60. And it fits into this book in so many different ways. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame talk. I mean, first of all, is talking about women in mid-century country music, crossing over in all of these different, operating in all these like really formative and important genres of music, kind of changing the kind of more masculineness narrative of country. And also, very concerned about the musical narratives of women country artists that offer varying perspectives about the concerns and desires of women that push against, gender norms, and Rose Maddox and rockabilly, and then Wanda Jackson singing like Fujiyama Mama, just pushing against right these gender norms of like, of containment. There's nothing that sounds any remotely contained in those recordings or those performances. So the Rose Maddox research that I did for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame talk, it's the California section of my book. So the book focuses on the geographical production of country music and situates women in particular at the center of these major like geographical locations: Chicago, California, and then finally Nashville. So yeah, but it was great. I had a great time.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. And what a great cover on your book, too. I love it. That's a cover to aspire to on a book. That's fantastic. Well, I mean, I think now that we've gone through all those, it is amazing to just even hear each of you. And thank you to all of you for, giving talks. And even Theo, who hasn't come here to give it yet. Theo, we should mention you were here a few years ago to do a talk on Devo and some of your research on your book on New Wave. So you've been here as a guest before and lectured and given presentations. I mean, just think of the ground these talks that you guys just described even cover. And David, I was thinking when you were talking too about how, for all of us who teach rock and roll or popular music, like, Mandy and I might talk and say, well, like, do we have to go back to the 1920s? But in some ways you feel like you kind of do, right? Because so much of the industry and the styles and the way things were put together that still impact music today come out of that time period. But then, Loren, you're talking about performance practice, or Stephanie on gender, Steve on rhythm and the importance of that, and Theo, these sort of ways that form and style and sound work out. there's so many different ways and elements you can look at. So I think we wanted to kind of open it up and just have all of us think back for a minute. And David, I'll use you as an example here again, just because I mentioned interpreting popular music of yours. You know, I should mention I knew you at the time you were working on it, and Theo and I were pretty close to you back then too. And you know, in the beginning of that, you even had to kind of go through the debate over sort of analyzing music versus context, right? And that's something that I think we do here at the museum. It's actually a foundational pillar of how we educate at the Rock Hall, is we talk about sound, context, and then producing meaning out of it. And I think it's a real great rubric for us in a museum where you have artifacts, but you're always coming back to sound and how meaning can be produced at multiple levels by different communities across time. But there's so much of those things about the early period of popular music studies, even going back, you know, into the late 80s, into the 90s. You know, there were calls for, do we need a unified theory of how to study popular music? I don't think we ever got there, and it's probably for the better that we didn't, I guess I would say, right? Because it leads to this real beautiful way that we can look at many different layers and different theories about different music. You know, Loren, the way you look at hip hop might influence the way somebody else goes and looks at a different style of music because similar mechanics are at work. So I just thought maybe we'd open it up with something like that to think about these sort of techniques of studying popular music and kind of what it means to all of us being here where we are now, knowing that all of us have been doing this for quite a long time at this point.
Well, I'll just wave the flag for drum kit studies, which is really a new way of doing popular music studies. Early scholarship that was focusing on things like sound very rarely considered the rhythm section as part of the sound, particularly work by musicologists who are jumping into the field of popular music studies. So while we have this kind of debate, how much are we looking and analyzing the texts, and how much are we looking and talking about context and social mening, even when we were looking at the sound, we weren't looking at all the sound. We weren't hearing the drums of rock and roll. So I think from that perspective, the field has changed radically. And now, I mean, I think there's a critical mass of drummers who are now contributing to the field. And there is a critical mass of scholarship out there on rhythm, drums, and the meanings they create in popular music. And I'm thinking of Matt Brennan's recent book, Kick It, A Special History of the Drum Kit, which is great. And now we have a Cambridge Companion to the Drum Kit, which I will mention. Mandy, one of our co-hosts, has an excellent chapter on drumming as embodied practice and the meanings of the drumming body. So I just wanted to acknowledge how one central element of popular music was not at all a part of popular music studies until very recently.
Yeah, David. Oh, make sure yourself too. There you go.
Yes, just to pick up on that, and you know, the significance of studying the rhythm section and how studying rhythm was not necessarily a part of musicology. I think, like in interpreting popular music, I was trying to understand how the sort of the contingency of musical value and how that's tied to even the way we study music, you know, and what counts as knowledge, and how the way we're trained and the techniques we have for studying music will influence what we find. And built into those techniques are a set of values, even though they might be presented to us as if they're neutral somehow. So, I mean, I wasn't alone in this. There's a well-known article by Susan McClary and Rob Waltzer called Start Making Sense. Richard Middleton critiqued the same thing, even Philip Tagg, to bring him up again. I mean, it was something people who were trying to write about popular music from a musicological perspective had to wrestle with, because not only was the topic was excluded, but it was also the techniques that we were trained in to study music often didn't yield very much that was interesting. So it forced you to confront how those techniques themselves are laden with value. And so you'll go looking at harmony and pitch, it will privilege pitch and harmony and these things which might be important in a piece of popular music, but they also might be very secondary or almost beside the point in a lot of it. Anyway, I'll just leave it there.
Well, I was even thinking of timbre, right? I mean, something we've
Yes,
all dealt with,
course.
I mean, which again was something that had to be dealt with. It's essential to most popular music. What were you going to say, man?
I was just going to say that's one of the frustrations I always had, in undergrad especially. I did not know like anything about classical music going into undergrad. I, grew up with a picture of the Sticky Fingers album cover in my living room, and I'm named after a Barry Manilow song. So like, I didn't know anything about classical music. And I remember being in this 19th century music theory class and listening to Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique. And we were supposed to do this, sonata form analysis of it. And I'm like, but what about these rhythms? Like, can we talk about what's happening in the rhythm here? And they're like, no, that's not really important. We need to just do this sonata form analysis. And it would always just blow my mind. And that's one of the reasons that I, went into drum kit studies, is because I was in a seminar with Rob Waltzer, and we read Steve's article about Ringo on the Revolver album. And when we read it, I asked Rob, I said, where can I find other things like this? Like, this is what I've been looking for. Like, this dude is like talking about what Ringo is doing. This is very important. And Rob was like, there's not really anything else like that. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. And he was right. There really wasn't much else like that. And to just not have studied that at the beginning of popular music studies sometimes kind of blows my mind. But I think, David, you're right in that, back at the beginning of popular music studies, you had to find a way into musicology. And if you had, from the beginning, talked about just the most popular music where harmony wasn't super important and you had to focus on rhythm and timbre, I don't know that it would have ever even become a thing in musicology at all.
Well, I think even the first people who were writing about it didn't ignore rhythm, texture, and timbre. It was more that people felt they had to make some kind of statement about it and argue for its value. You couldn't just assume it would be accepted, or that people would understand why you're writing about this music and why you're writing about these aspects of it. But now I think people are more interested in looking at rhythm, texture, and timbre in classical music.
Yeah.
I mean, really, why not?
Yeah.
Like you said, man, it's like, why are we not talking about this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to jump in just because I want to, thanks, Mandy, for bringing up Rob's name. Like, we should, give a shout out to Rob Waltzer, because I think 4 of us had him as an advisor that are here, right? Mandy, Steve, Stephanie, and me all, worked closely with him. And so in a lot of ways, like, the questions about method and the approaches that scholars have taken to studying popular music, I think in a lot of ways go back to, not only Running with the Devil as a book that did close analysis of music, that there were, there are musical examples in there, but there's also a lot of discourse analysis. There's some ethnography. There's really a mix of approaches and methodologies, I really feel like that, throwing in, like, I think Rob really was looking for whatever worked to, what are the questions you want to ask, and then get the methods from the kinds of questions that you want to answer. And so I really think popular music studies as a field, one of the things that's exciting that I love about it is that it's a field that's driven by questions, and then it's got that DIY, ethos of, well, what's the right tool for the job, versus some other disciplines that have histories that are tied more closely to, strict ideas about what are the methods that everybody has to know how to use. I think pop studies being interdisciplinary and relatively new to the game just has allowed scholars to take a variety of approaches.
Freedom.
And I'll just throw in there that the second edition, the new edition of Running with the Devil, Rob added a chapter on drums and drumming in heavy metal music.
Yeah, he did. I'm teaching this seminar this semester on popular music and genre. And David, I used your book quite a bit, but I also brought in Rob's book too. And being a very early scholar of pop music, addressing genre and how to address it, and it really starts the conversation about what constitutes genre. Is it just the sound, the styles, kind of the discursive field, like the social discursive elements that surround genre, and how meaningful it is for listeners, and the ways in which genre beyond the music and in the music communicates to particular listening audiences. Yeah. So it's interesting. We're still having a lot of these same conversations in pop music studies.
I wanted to jump in. I mean, I agree with all this stuff that's swirling around, and especially echo something that Loren said, which is that I think even though we're musicologists, that a big attraction of popular music studies was precisely the freedom of interdisciplinarity that we felt, that you weren't bound to specific boxes or techniques, and that you could kind of invent as you went along, taking from different areas to apply to make sense and meaning of what you were writing about. And that's one of the big attractions of popular music studies. And then I'll just, another thing I'll mention is that I'm struck by how much the types of music have expanded that people have written about, say, compared to when I was starting out. I gave my first AMS talk 25 years ago, and AMS had a single panel for popular music that was simply called rock music, and that was it. And you wouldn't find a panel like that on AMS today. It would be like rock music and something, or popular music. It would be much more nuanced. It wouldn't simply be this kind of monolith. So that to me is one of the exciting things, is just the explosion of varieties of music that people write about compared to a couple decades ago. And I find that very exciting.
Here. Yeah, I agree with Theo on that 100%. I think we still have a long way to go. I mean, I think there's still a bias towards, English language music. Like, think about how big, I mean, we're in North America, but, the AMS in particular, it's an international organization. And just, I mean, and this is a problem. It's not just popular music studies, it's widespread across, musicology in general. But I just feel like as big as Spanish language pop is right now, like there was, I mean, I was on a panel about Latin American pop music. So it was cool to see that at AMS. So I definitely want to make sure to mention that, but it's that there's still room for us to grow in a lot of ways. Actually, I guess maybe, is that a question for the panel? Like, where should we be heading, or where are things heading?
I think that's a great question, Loren.
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to point out, like, some of the things that, like, I am, in country music, the Rusoli Award went to Uncharted Country. Nadine, right? Nadine has or Uncharted Country, New Voices and Perspectives in Country Music, edited by Nadine Hubbs and Francis Royster, which is this exciting collection that is talking about country music in relation to, like, LGBTQ plus presence and African American presence in country music, which is, if you caught the CMAs last week, it was really timely, how the country music itself, the industry itself, is having kind of a racial reckoning, and also dealing with sexualities in a broader sense now. The actual
was Lil Nas X at the CMAs?
I don't know if he was there, but Jimmy Allen got Entertainer of the Year award, or most promising entertainer, and Mickey Guyton sang a song about hair, natural hair for African American, young women, being like this one young woman who was, like, harassed in school because of her braids and stuff. So yeah, and also, right, the huge, like, music country soul moment too, with Chris Stapleton and I forgot her name. Her name's Jennifer Hudson, right? This country soul moment. Kind of like gesturing back to all those interesting genre intermixes that the industry has tried to, like, separate, but have always been there, and they're, like, right there in front of us.
As Loren was saying, we still have a long way to go in terms of expanding the kinds of musics that popular music studies has been embracing. A trend in Canada lately, there's been a lot of excellent work on indigeneity in popular music. I'm thinking of the work of Kate Galloway. So that's one area that popular music studies has, at least in Canada. Canadian scholars have begun the hard work of decolonizing the field.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to comment on both of these topics, what Stephanie said, well, that's a song by Lou Reed. Stephanie Says. You probably Stephanie Says that someone I'm supervising, Rebecca Hutton, gave a talk last year about Beyonce and the Chicks performance at the Country Music Awards too. And so yeah, and that, one of the things about genre, sorry to harp on this, is that there's always a tension there between the way we use labels to communicate music, which implies a kind of stability, and sort of the awareness people have that these are never sufficient and they don't capture the complexity and nuance that we know about the music that's being referenced by the label, or the complexity of individual people's taste, or how the role of music in people's lives. So in one article I wrote, I called it the imaginary sort of life of genre, which is stable, and our sort of lived experience of genre, which is very messy, where the boundaries are always blurring and changing. And Beyonce can perform with the Chicks, or these other performances you mentioned. There was an article in the New Yorker, I think it was probably about the performer you just mentioned, African-American country performer. I mean, all these things that seem like contradictions, but in a way they're not, because this kind of practice is going on all the time in terms of music that doesn't, has elements of country, but it's classified as R&B, or the reverse. Music history is filled with these things. The other thing to speak to what Steve was saying, and it was something I've been thinking about, because I think the discipline of musicology, popular music studies, music journalism popular music journalism has really been undergoing a sea change in terms of questioning the canon, in terms of the realization of the sort of white patriarchal nature of the canon, and this kind of thing. And so it's really, I think it's been very positive, of course, positive in terms of the expansion of what people are writing about and the way they're writing about older topics. You also see it in something like the Rolling Stones top 500 albums. If you compare the last one to the several before, it's completely upended. And this projection of some kind of stable canon based on a kind of rockist or rock era set of preferences is really been destabilized quite a bit. I'm wondering how you're feeling that at the Rock Hall, if it's having any impact. I know the inductees, I think, have become more diverse in terms of genre and demographics and that kind of thing.
I mean, even this year alone, if you look at the performer category, which is the category that gets voted on, it was half women. So for the Go-Go's, you had the Foo Fighters. For Carole King, you had Todd Rundgren. For Tina Turner, you had Jay-Z. So it was like split right down the middle. And then, with Carole King and Tina Turner, you had your second and third two-time women Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees. Tina Turner, your first two-time woman of color inductee. And so we're really seeing the ballots and the classes of inductees changing the past few years. And I am I, for one, am extremely excited about it.
Yeah, and I think, David, you're so right. That idea of canon, I think, is something that's important for us to think of in popular music too, right? Because when we're teaching popular music or writing or researching or being in a museum like we are, obviously the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, because we have inductees, is by default some level of canon making. But I do think,
and we're another level of canon making because we include other musicians in the museum that are not necessarily inducted. So there's kind of layers
Two
of
layers,
canon
yeah.
going on here.
So even the way we think about it, right, or the way the museum is trying to move forward, I think we're trying to be part of that destabilization of that classic rock canon as well. Going back and inducting over the last number of years, a few of us were talking about Gail Wald earlier, her great book on Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Yeah. She's now a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee. And to the point where when she was inducted, many people said to us, well, why is she getting inducted? Who is she? And then when they found out, people were like, oh, well, that makes sense. Why didn't you induct her sooner? So we like those conversations. I think those are good. But,
I have to say that when I gave my talk at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I argued on behalf of Sister Rosetta Tharpe being inducted, because in my talk, I pointed out that not only was she pioneer of the electric guitar, she was a pioneer of the backbeat. It is through her that I got into Lucky Millender's band and into who played behind Wynonie Harris's Good Rockin' Tonight.
Yeah. Well, and Chuck Berry once said that his whole career was just one big Sister Rosetta Tharpe impersonation. So how could you not induct her?
And I think there's a piece of that too when you think back to, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and who our inductees are and how that's shifting over time. And it's really, people will take us to task for inducting hip hop artists, or the fact that we have not been historically good on inducting women. But I think that's not just the case of the Rock Hall. That's true of much of the history, again, of Rolling Stone, of journalism, of the way rock and roll has been treated. Even going back, Stephanie, to your point that, in rockabilly, there were these amazing women who were out there. Many of those stories which get covered up over time and moved away from. That history is still there, though, right?
Right. I was just remembering how Rose Maddox in an interview said that Elvis was very impressed with the Maddox brothers and Rose, because they were on the Louisiana hayride at the same time. And Elvis was like, oh, wow, you guys are doing what I want to do, and you've been doing it before me. So, and with Rose Maddox as like the front person, the singer, and she would also play bass too. They would use string basses to give you that beat before, because there were no drums. So, So, I mean, the presence of women in rockabilly, early rock and roll, is very important to keep in mind.
I think maybe a way to even think of this idea of canon and kind of open it up to all of you guys is to think about how maybe each of us teaches or writes about popular music. And, Mandy and I did a very interesting exercise. We teach a class with the local community college, Cuyahoga Community College here. That's a popular music, rock and roll survey, basically. But we went through that whole syllabus and challenged ourselves to see what did we actually need to teach in each time period, right? And we got to a point where we said, do we actually need to teach Bob Dylan? And I know, on some level you might say, well, sacrilege, how can you teach that? But we didn't, actually. We didn't end up choosing him because we tried to get a much more diverse look at artists throughout the history of rock and roll, right?
And when we wanted to teach the folk revival, actually, Dylan is not a clean folk revival story. He muddles it up way too much. So we actually went with Joan Baez.
So maybe to bring it back to each of you, and Theo, I know I always enjoy your social media posts as you teach throughout the semester and share some really, interesting insights that you or your students have about sort of rock history as you look at it. Because, of course, they're coming at it from a radically different perspective, potentially, than all of us are here on this panel, right?
Yeah, I mentioned this when I was, talking about what I'm going to present about alternative rock, that a lot of it comes out of my teaching. And, this question about a canon, I would say like the canon of tracks or songs that I use for teaching are probably different than if someone asked me like, what are like the 50 greatest like pop or rock songs of all time, because they're different things. The music that I teach, like I try to think, how much mileage can I get out of this piece? And Jason, you and I have had this conversation. You know, my pet progressive rock piece on my syllabus to this day is Fire on High by the Electric Light Orchestra, which would not be on any canon of like greatest pieces that I would offer to anybody. But in a classroom, I squeeze like 25 minutes, you know, out of explaining things that then explain something about progressive rock at that time. So I think the situations in which we use rock music and popular music kind of dictate what type of canon we're talking about. And the second thing I'll say, you know, is that a lot of what ends up, you know, that I'm teaching about, I actually am inspired by my fellow scholars. I'll read an article of theirs and then I'll want to teach that piece. So this week, you know, in class, we were teaching Dolly Parton. Not we, I was teaching Dolly Parton. And I ended up using the song Me and Little Andy, which is a kind of deeper catalog piece of hers I wouldn't have known about had I not heard Mitchell Morris, you know, now at UCLA, talk about, you know, 20 years ago at a conference paper. So I think the canons that we kind of construct in a lot of way are informed by each other's work, hopefully, so that we're kind of learning from one another, and as much as we're learning from our students too.
I think a lot also has to do with the context within which you have to teach. At my institution, and I'm sure at many others, the rock and roll class is a 500 student elective, many international students, and for those purposes, a canon is very helpful and very useful. I mean, there are reasons that some pieces are canonized in that they capture the moment, enormously successful, influential, and what have you. And often when you're teaching to a room full of 500 students, none of whom are music majors, many of whom are international students, kind of the big brush strokes that you get and laid out in so many textbooks who go over so much of the same material. It's useful in that context, whereas on the rare occasions, at least when I get to teach a class dealing with popular music one way or another in a smaller context, I'm much more free to choose less conventional works. So, and this is a bigger problem in popular music studies in the academy. It's no secret that many music departments embrace popular music studies to bail out the lack of students and the lack of enrollment in their programs, to prop up their classical music study programs. And I'm hoping we're moving to a point where popular music studies is no longer seen by administrators as a cash cow to support the real music, and can be taught with the same kind of rigor and variety that we have always afforded classical music.
I should mention too, to anybody out there watching, we are going to have a little bit of time here towards the end for some questions. So if you have one, make sure you put them down below this video in the chat, and we'll be happy to take a look. If anybody has any questions, I did see one comment down there from Patrick Rivers, who is another previous Rock Hall AMS presenter. Hello, Patrick out there. Great to see. I think Patrick's paper, if I remember correctly, was on the drum machine in that as well, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a great paper, Patrick. Thank you for watching out there and joining us. You know, Stephen, going off of what you were just bringing up about teaching in these sort of large groups, I think it's something that Mandy and I are very invested in for obvious reasons, but also I think was part of the push for this very Rock Hall AMS lecture series, which is sort of this topic of public musicology, or taking scholarly work and research on rock history or popular music history and trying to connect it out to a larger public. And I wanted to maybe get each of your ideas on that. I mean, I think all of us are probably pretty invested generally in the concept, but you know, what does that mean? What does it mean to say we're going to take rock and roll or something we're studying on a research level and bring it out? Mandy and I have a very practical way in which we often have to do that in a museum. And some of that even comes from, you know, the work we've been doing and you've really been leading here with performance and kind of performance-based learning about rock and roll, and the garage that we're in right now. But I was wondering from each of you what you think about that idea. Like, so Steve, what do your students in that 500-person class, like, what are they walking away with? And I don't mean to sound crass about it, but like, what is that moment of teaching them about popular music doing, right?
Yeah, they learn a lot of history through music. They learn issues relating to race, gender, sexuality, class, these kinds of things. They do learn a repertory, and for the large class, and again, another thing I'm noticing, 10 years ago, I could rely on the students knowing who Elvis Presley was. That's not the case anymore. It really is not the case anymore. So these big survey classes where it's 500 students, you are really, hitting the big ticket items through history. And again, Canada's useful. I mean, there's so much that a student can learn by looking at clips of Elvis Presley perform and knowing the context of those performances.
I guess oh, do you want to go ahead, David? Oh, okay. Two things come to mind for me. One is, like, when I teach popular music courses, getting students to, like, finding current issues, like social issues, and how, and really thinking, like, yeah, popular, rock and roll, popular music, hip hop, whatever. It's fun. It's stuff we do with our friends. It's social. It's often thought of as something that's like outside of like work or, serious issues or whatever. But I really try to challenge my students to think about, why is it important that we even have college classes about popular music? Like, what do you walk away from after taking this class that's going to help you engage in the world around you, in social issues or things that are happening right now, like in the world that you might want to have a voice in? A good example of that, when I teach my hip hop class, we talk about the use of rap lyrics and how they're being introduced as evidence in criminal trials. Like, so for example, that if somebody had had a book of poetry and they were accused of a crime, that the prosecutor could introduce their rap lyrics as evidence that they have a propensity for violence, And I think, without taking up too much time, I mean, I think it's ridiculous, right? I mean, the idea that like rap is that rather than being treated as music or as art or as poetry and all of the creative license that goes with that, it would be interpreted as a kind of literal, like, confession, right, of a person, And of course, this is something that these ideas about like rock and roll and being a bad influence, or kind of like heavy metal is dangerous, and all this stuff that that we've seen it before, but it takes on a particular racial dimension with hip hop. And so I feel like the kinds of classes that we teach are actually important, because how we listen to music and what the meaning we make from it matters. And in some cases, it can matter with life and death consequences. And so, not to get too heavy, here, but I really do think that part of being when you say public musicology or public popular music studies, for me, it's about, well, why does any of this stuff matter? Yeah, sure, the music sounds great. Sure, we love it. It's a big part of our lives. But why do we do what we do? And why is it important to engage our students or engage the public with the kinds of, perspectives that we bring? I did say there was a second thing, didn't I? I'll stop now and let somebody else go.
Yeah, David.
Yeah. Well, so I put together a book called The Pop, Rock, and Soul Reader, which now is in its 4th edition. So I was just thinking, what I've changed in the different editions. And I mean, one thing that I made a conscious effort to do is to increase the work of women authors and discussions of women musicians. And it wasn't that when I did the first edition in 2003 or 2004, I wasn't against it, having more discussions of women. It was just, I think we are all, we're individuals. We have choices we make that have an impact, but at the same time, we're part of a larger stream of discourse. Like, we're in dialogue with everyone else. And to me, that just says the awareness, I mean, of course, I'm speaking as a white man, so I'm sure women might have been, some women were probably much more aware than I was in 2004 that this was an important thing to do. But I'm just saying the general awareness that you just have to do this, you can't put a book out that doesn't, deal with this has really changed. And so the same is true of canons, where, okay, now you look at these, the inductees to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, you look at the top 500 albums of all time, and okay, it's like the center, any idea of a center for the canon has gone. But what has taken its place? It seems to be, like we're now like a bunch of different islands of taste that are kind of orbiting around, which is fine. And I don't know if a new consensus will ever emerge, but it's kind of comes about through the same way I think genres might stabilize momentarily, which is through dialogues, through some ideas having more appeal to people at one time. So they're picked up, they're repeated, and this is in dialogue with all kinds of larger social currents and political forces that are going on. So then to come back to what I think Steve and Loren were saying, in that reader and in my courses, I try to look at both, obviously there are pieces of, recordings that we listen to and videos of performances, but they're picked really for how they respond to different kinds of cultural, historical, social issues or moments. So there's a history, but then each example is kind of an example of, some sort of, moment or something where music has something that highlights the social significance of popular music in one way or another. So the ways of getting at that are through the statements of musicians themselves. There's journalism. There's also, accounts of fans, and what they've thought. But in that way, I'm trying to make it meaningful for students because they see, as Loren said, it's, it's entertainment, but it's more than entertainment. When you're aware of where the musicians are coming from themselves, sort of their own kind of social background and what music meant for them in their lives, how the music might have sparked a controversy or been part of different kinds of political and social controversies. There are many of them. And how that lines up with, lines up or doesn't line up with other sort of larger historical currents that are happening.
I'd like to add to that. I think a lot of like my teaching, and I think with all my colleagues and friends here, their teaching is a form of public musicology, right? And where I'm teaching, it's addressing a diverse student body too. Popular music is great for that. It like reaches the sensibilities, the political ideas of a diverse student body as the universities are changing. And I just taught today Beyonce. I introduced her, and I'm teaching Beyonce to a generation that grew up on Beyonce. And what I love to notice about this generation is they are feminists. Like I asked in 2018, I asked my class, how many of you identify as feminists? And the majority of them raised their hand. And I'm like, it's because of Beyonce and her 2013 album, right? When she has the voiceover of Adichie explaining how we treat and raise our girls differently and our boys. That beautiful music video, Flawless, beginning with Girls' Time, losing out to a male rock band. But who do we know today? It's not that male rock band that won that music competition. It is Beyonce. So, and what I've noticed about my students, they are so savvy about understanding and listening to popular music today. Like they get it. Whether it's Lady Gaga, Sam Smith, Beyonce, they really understand the politics involved, the gendered and sexual and racial politics, and the negotiation and the tightrope that so many women in popular music must walk. And they're supporting Britney Spears, and they know of just the way she crashed in front of the gaze of popular media, the multimedia, and how other women like Lady Gaga and Beyonce have managed to recreate themselves in ways that stays one step above, or one step ahead of kind of the patriarchal frame of pop music. And my students are, and I'm sure all of your students are too, so savvy. They know exactly what's going on. And so it's so much fun to teach them Annie Lennox, because they're like,
Right.
who? What? And you're like, oh, look, or David Bowie. Some of them do know Bowie, but not like they used to. It's different now. So I think it's a really powerful cultural form of expression that I think, to quote George Lipset, that very few other forms of cultural expression takes you to places where you have access to these issues of race, class, gender, sexuality to such a degree that makes it, so visible and visceral and apparent to our students. So.
And not only do you have that sort of point of access to all of those really important topics, but I feel like one of the other things that makes popular music such a powerful method to reach students with is, every student has a million songs that if they heard that song, they can be transported back to a time in their life, to their first kiss, to, the song that was playing when they were holding their grandma's hand when they passed away, Mm-hmm. Music just has this ability to just transport you to this different time and place. And so when people already have that sort of buy-in, and then it's this, like Stephanie was saying, this great entryway to all of these really important topics. I just think that nothing beats studying any topic through the lens of popular music.
Yeah.
Well, we're almost out of time, but we did have a couple of questions come in. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One from someone out there. I think it's actually a good point, and it's one actually I think you and I deal with a lot. Isn't calling the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame rockist? Should the museum be renamed to reflect the diversity of genres it expresses? I think, thank you. It's actually a well-worded question, because I think we do strive to represent so many different things. In fact, we spend a lot of time explaining to people that rock and roll to us is the reason this museum exists, but it's also more the umbrella under which we study a lot of popular music styles, right?
And we take very seriously that, rock and roll is like the branch or the trunk of a tree that has so many roots and so many branches. And I think for us, it's like an attitude thing. Rock and roll has a certain attitude to it that I think resonates well with this museum.
Yeah, it's sort of, I think we think of rock and roll as it's where this museum began. It's with the heart of rock and roll at the center of it, but it continues to grow and move out from there. And then somebody else asked too, this is actually a pretty long question to answer, but we'll give it a shot. How do we deal, anybody on this panel, with teaching about musicians who've been convicted of crimes or serious allegations? So there's that aspect that these are people who are still out there, right? How do you guys deal with that in classes if you have that with a particular artist? Comes up a lot with a lot of different genres of popular music.
I'll let someone else answer most of the question, but I'll say if we only talk about artists who were pure and noble, we might not have much to talk about.
It's just going to be like Rage Against the Machine.
But anyway, that's slightly facetious. I'm sure someone else has a better answer.
Well, it's the Michael Jackson question. You can't teach a history of popular music without including Michael Jackson, for obvious reasons, his success and his artistic spectacularness. For me, it's a matter of contextualizing. I believe it was Will Chang had a great piece. And you know, this whole question, do you separate the music from the artist? In so many cases, you really can't, because the music is part of our attraction to Michael Jackson. It is part of what enabled him, if the allegations are true, that enabled him to attract and groom these kids that he abused. So, as David was saying, if you're going to erase everybody who's got a blemish on their personal history, you have a very small museum. But at the same time, I think for major cases of horrible behavior, that should be part of the teaching of that artist.
Yeah, I think we all probably agree with that.
Yeah, and I think it depends on audience. You know, when I'm teaching about Chuck Berry to toddlers, no, I don't bring up that he violated the Mann Act. You know, I'm not going to say that to a 4-year-old. But when I teach it, you know, in our community college class, I say, like, hey, you know, this is what happened. This is what he was convicted of at a time when Black men were often wrongly convicted of things. So there's so many layers to that story. But then I do say, like, you can't teach the history of rock and roll without Chuck Berry. I mean, you just really can't do it. He was so unbelievably important, and there's so many figures throughout the history of rock and roll, from Phil Spector to Africa Bambaataa to Michael Jackson, who you just cannot leave out of the story, but you also can't leave sort of their whole contribution out of the story.
Yeah, Phil Spector came up for us recently. We did something online with the Rock Hall, and you know, again, you're going to talk about a certain period. You're probably going to talk about Phil Spector eventually, but we did have a conversation as a museum and decide to, you know, mention and do a little contextualization even in this public piece we were doing about him, just because it has to be mentioned. You know, I think if you leave it out, you're doing a disservice to the story and
to the victims.
And to the victims, right? Exactly. Yes.
Well, also, I think Phil Spector is a great example, because that really leads right into a sort of teachable moment, because his whole way, even before he became a murderer, his way of dealing with women in the studio and in his artistic and professional relationships is directly related to the recordings you hear and the power relationships in the production of those recordings is manifested in those recordings, and in how history has, you know, treated the performers versus Phil Spector.
And
especially if you're trying to understand Darlene Love or Ronnie Spector or any of the performers who worked with him, right?
Yeah,
and his manipulative, exploitative patterns are also reflected in the financial remuneration for those recordings.
Exactly.
Well, let's end on a fun one. There were a couple questions here, and I know some of you and I wanted to ask. I sent all of this to you ahead of time and said, let's think about if each of you got a chance to, we'll talk about our Rock Hall canon, induct somebody. This is your forum. Is there anyone you would like to advocate for? A game I know Theo Cateforis and Mandy and I play frequently. Who do you want to see inducted in the Rock Hall? Anybody have one they want to put up?
Can I start?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. I thought about this for too long. So give me two, let me have two answers here.
Okay.
We tend to have this discussion around performers, I think. So I'll start with a performer. I think Bikini Kill should be in the Rock Hall. But the more I thought about it, I realized that there's a whole sector of photographers, filmmakers, fashion designers, choreographers who have no like induction or representation on that level. So I would like to see the Rock Hall start to address that. Like get, you know, Henry Diltson or get Charlie Atkins from Motown.
Yes.
Like get D.A. Pennebaker, get any of these people, or Hypnosis, like for the album design. Like get those people in. That's my polemic right there for you.
Theo, I think I think both of those are very good. Bikini Kill is great. And I think also you're right. And interestingly enough, in the early days, the Rock Hall dipped its toe into some of those categories. And then it kind of moved away from that. And I agree. I think getting back to some of those, ideas of the industry and the folks who made rock and roll what it was, it's really important. Yeah. All right, who else? Anybody else? I see we've got Lindsay online there was asking for Devo.
Uh-huh.
That's one I know Theo and
Theo
I both are
agrees.
probably going for Dio for sure. Devo's great.
I'm going to make a plug for Judas Priest.
Yes.
They are at the forefront of an entire genre, the new wave of British heavy metal. They have an iconic look. They are at the center of issues around censorship in popular music. They were tried in court for having degrading influence, leading kids to kill themselves. And of course, the fact that Rob Halford, the leader of a genre appealing to largely white working class men and projecting these masculinist values, came out as gay at the height of his popularity. So I think there's a lot of reasons that they would be a good selection.
I agree.
Judas Priest is great. They've actually been nominated a few times. I will say, Mandy and I talked about this a lot. Any of the new wave of British heavy metal bands who have been nominated have not gotten inducted.
Except for Def Leppard.
Yes, fair enough.
Yep.
Def Leppard. But interesting enough, no Motorhead, no Maiden, no Priest, no Saxon.
Nope.
But
No girl
yeah,
band.
it's interesting to think about that whole part of rock history hasn't really gotten in here yet. Metallica and the bands that come after that have. So kind of an interesting piece. That's a great choice, Steve. Anybody else want one?
Yeah, sure.
Loren?
Fine. I was gonna wait, but oh yeah, I definitely have one. Sylvester. Sylvester got his start, in LA, running around with a group of cross-dressing, Black teenagers in South Central LA, moved up to San Francisco to the Haight-Ashbury, like his early musical recordings were, in very much like actually rock centric before he was a disco star. He was a rocker. I don't, there's no dispute about that, even in a more strict, like traditional sense.
Yeah.
I mean, when David Bowie failed to sell out his concerts in San Francisco, he said they don't need me, they have Sylvester. But everything that he did to be kind of unapologetically himself as an openly gay man, the way he played with his the way he presented himself, costuming, and blurred the gender lines way before that became an accepted and normal part of the popular music landscape. He's kind of the arguably, the one who took those chances and risks at a time when the costs could have been pretty high, and succeeded despite that. So yeah, I'd really like to see Sylvester get his due, unfortunately posthumously, but would love to see that.
Yeah, that's a great one too. And I know John, our producer who's sitting over there, is a big fan of Sylvester too. So he's giving a big high five right now.
Right on.
Yeah, that's
Even the
one.
Arsenio.
That's right.
And just a shout out, to check, I mean, Josh Gamson's wonderful book, The Fabulous Sylvester. If you haven't read that, it's my favorite music biography. So it's a great one to teach students. I mean, it's written, it's not a typical academic book, but it's very smart. And I recommend it to everyone who I get a chance to. So
Awesome. Stephanie, did you have one too, I think?
Yeah, we were talking before we went live. Chaka Khan, I think, would be a great one, right? She's so influential. I mean, right, was started in the 70s, continued with so many awards, for best R&B artist, influential, Prince covered some of her music. So yeah, I'm all for her.
Yeah, amazing performer. I mean, she's just incredible. And even thinking about the Rock Hall recently with Tina Turner as a solo artist, or Whitney Houston. I mean, Chaka Khan.
Janet Jackson.
Yeah, Janet Jackson, great, right? Yeah.
Fit right in.
Chaka Khan, yeah, Whitney Houston, her being influenced, her influence from Chaka Khan too. Yeah, so yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
And
Well,
also,
David, your last one.
and also
I'm embarrassed to say I didn't think about it, and so I don't know who's.
You can vote for Sylvester. It's cool. You can
Hey, I support all the people who were mentioned, so I think those are great additions.
Loren, I was waiting. I thought you were going to do like vote trading, like pull people on your side. I wanted to see your
Do I
argument.
have to choose one of those? Can I be the final arbiter?
I mean, this could just be who we induct next year.
Yeah,
we
there
should,
you go.
We should talk to the
That
higher
would be a
ups.
great
Sylvester,
class.
Chaka Khan, Charlie Atkins,
Bikini Kill.
Bikini
Judas
Kill,
Priest.
and Judas Priest.
Yeah.
I'm sold.
Yeah.
Let's throw
Well-
Memphis Minnie in as well as an early influence.
Yeah.
Please.
I mean, she wrote When the Levee Breaks.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Okay.
And the Carter family.
Yeah, that's one of Mandy and mine's big one. Is
Oh, the
Carter family is
Carter
not-
family.
Yeah.
they're not in. They're not in.
No. Doesn't make any
Shocking.
sense.
It's shocking that it's not in.
We talk about this all the time. Why are they? And we have one of Mother Maybell's guitars downstairs. You're thinking about even just a guitar style influence, right?
Yeah.
Well, let me say to all of you, thank you so much. First of all, for originally participating in the Rockall series, or Theo getting excited for yours that'll be coming up soon. And thank you for joining us tonight. I think this was a really fun conversation about some really great research and work that's been done in the area of popular music and continues to be done. And, really fun conversation just thinking about where popular music studies came from and where it's potentially going, right?
Yeah. My only regret is that I can't give you all hugs because I miss you all so much.
That's right, our virtual AMS hugs. And thank you to everybody out there watching tonight. We're really glad that you were all able to join us and partake in this conversation. So hopefully all of you out there will get to see you sometime soon. So on behalf of the American Musicological Society and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, thank you everyone and good night.
Thanks. Good night, everybody.